for joining us today. We're here to provide you with an update on the 520 floating bridge and pontoon project. Since the pontoon issues first arrived back in May of last year, we've conducted 25 media outreaches, interviews, briefings, tours, explanatory videos, etc. And we are also working to make sure that our transparency and accountability on this project is at the highest level. We've had and released 18,000 documents during public disclosure requests. We take our role as designers, builders, and providers of the 520 corridor very seriously. And today what I want to do is give you an update on the processes that we've had in place to understand the findings. John Reilly is here from our expert review panel. The findings of the expert panel review of the problems with the 520 pontoons, have been working on design and construction protocols with the expert panel. Jeff Carpenter is our state construction engineer. He'll walk you through the repairs that we will be making and have made as we work through the first cycle of pontoons that are on Lake Washington, and also the second cycle that is in the casting basin in Aberdeen. Julie Meredith, Program Director, will give you an update on the overall budget and schedule for the project. And I will share with you also the results of an internal review that I commissioned as we came to understand where we had problems with the pontoons and where WSDOT had some responsibility. What is it that happened? What do we learn from that? What are the accountabilities that come with that? And how do we proceed forward to make sure that in the future we're on the right path with the pontoon delivery and any other kind of a design build contract in a mega project of this magnitude. So before we get to the presentation, I want to emphasize 3 points. The existing 520 bridge remains vulnerable. It is something that we have recognized years ago with the legislature and the community and have been working diligently to replace the seismic and wind vulnerable structure as it is in place today. That's why we began the project when we did, why we've had a compressed work schedule, and why we've spent every effort we can to make sure this bridge gets replaced before a catastrophic event would happen. The second point is that WSDOT does bear some responsibility for the majority of the challenges that we've had on this project, and we've been open about that as we've met with our legislators, and we've talked about what we've learned and how we understand what the flaws were. Before you understand what the flaws are, it's very hard to fix it and to make sure that all of the pontoons in the future will be strong and safe. When we discovered problems on these pontoons, and as we came to understand that we had design issues with the pontoons, it was very important to me to make sure that we put to rest the notion of whether these pontoons are safe, whether they're sound, and whether they'll serve the public for the 75-year design life. As an engineer myself, I take very seriously the responsibilities of our profession and the responsibilities of the professional engineers and technical folks in our agency who have the issues and the responsibilities to make sure that we provide excellent products for the state. And I'm proud to say that our agency has done a marvelous job on the projects that we've delivered, the nickel, the TPA, the 421 projects that the legislature entrusted us to produce and deliver. But we've had some problems on this project, and we want to be very clear about what those are. As we get into the report, you'll see that where our majority of our problem has come was through a design flaw in the pontoon, which WSDOT owns the design of. When we decided that we needed, and worked with the legislature and came up with a delivery date of December of 2014, it was very important for us to use concurrent processes to deliver this project, both the environmental work, to replace the vulnerable pontoons, to design and build the floating bridge and landing, which was the rest of the pontoons, and to finish the 520 corridor so that it can continue to serve the region and the state because of its economic value to the state. As we have come to find through this internal review, which we can talk more about as we get into it, part of the delivery was made more complex in that we had a designed set of pontoons, which the state owns the responsibility for, inside of a design bid or a design build contract, the kind of a contract we had not administered before. So keep that thought, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But just to be clear as we work through today, and I know you have questions, we cannot and will not negotiate the financial settlement with the contractor and the media. We will not talk about, nor do we exactly know what the cost responsibility to the state is. We can talk about where we are on negotiations with a change order for the first and initial repairs, and what we plan to do next, so that will come. I think what we'll first do is remind you of the changes that we made when we had the expert panel's first report issued late last summer. The most important thing to us is to make sure the pontoons are safe, sound, and serve the public, but also to understand where we were having complex problems and what the nature of those problems were. So initially, we looked at what was the process out in the field, and we made some reassignments to strengthen our team in Aberdeen. We worked to add quality verification of the staff to make sure the contractor's means and methods were appropriate and per the contract responsibility. We looked to the expert panel to guide and work with designers in our own bridge office to make sure that the design was sound and run the models that would help pinpoint where the flaws were. And that has been done. And then we also developed a negotiating team to work with our contractor so that we as a state pay our contractors fairly and equitably, but do not pay 1 cent more than we should as we resolve the problems in the contract that we have today. So I would like to introduce John Reilly, who is the chair of the expert review panel. He will introduce the expert panel members who are with us today, and he'll talk you through the analysis that they did for us and their results and recommendations. John.
Thank you, Paula. Good afternoon. Glad to see you here. So I'm John Reilly, and I'm chair of the expert review panel. We have 2 of the panel members here today, John Clark over here, and Neil Hawkins. And the other members of the panel unfortunately couldn't be here. Basically, Tom Sherman, who has constructed pontoons like this for many years. Steve Tatro, who is a concrete specialist who's working with us on the concrete issues. And Mark Leonard, who is a former Colorado chief engineer for the Department of Highways in Colorado, who's now at the Federal Highway Administration. So in terms of the background today, to personalize this a bit, I've been working in this industry for 50 years. I first started with pre-stressed concrete back in 1965. I've known Neil Hawkins for 50 years at this point. And I've been working both on concrete design of buildings and structures, as well as the management of very large complex projects. So I bring a different perspective to this. Each of the panel members has a slightly different perspective. It's necessary to have those perspectives to figure out very quickly what we have in this condition. So, John, would you like to say something about your background?
Just that I have been designing bridges for the last 56 years. Some of the ones you might know, I was involved with both the 2 West Seattle freeway bridges, the high-level bridge and the Spring Bridge, cable stayed bridge in Pasco and one in Tacoma. And I've been involved with the I was still with the WSDOT way back 50 years ago. I was sent out to Hood Canal to look at the damage on the floating bridge out there. And I was involved with the governor's panel on the thinking of the bridge of the road. So I've seen these things for a long time.
Thank you, Neil.
I'm Neil Hawkins. I'm a former chair of civil engineering here at the University of Washington, associate dean for research, and I retired as a head of civil engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. My field of expertise is really reinforced and pre-stressed concrete, particularly subject to earthquake-type loadings. I was a member of the Blue Ribbon panel for Governor Bruce Gardner. There were 5 of us, and so I think I'm probably one of the last ones remaining. I know Phil Talmadge is still around, but I don't know quite how the others are going. To me, we made a contract with the people of the state of Washington to say that the floating bridges were safe. And so in joining this panel, it was my objective to see that that pledge was fulfilled. And I continue to want to see that pledge fulfilled. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. So let's talk about the panel. Last May 11th, there was some unexpected spalling and cracking of Pontoon B in the first cycle down in Aberdeen. So we want to differentiate two things. Spalling is cracking disruption of concrete that's based on force. So the pre-stressed tendons that actually reinforce and stress the pontoons cause that. So the question is, why did that happen? Neil was asked to look at that, find out what was happening working with the bridge section. And I immediately realized what the problem was. It was a deviation in the profile that caused stresses on the 11-inch keel slab, not the bolt beam, which is a much thicker section. And so at that point, there was added rebar, added concrete to reinforce that pontoon, and also to proactively do the same on the other two longitudinal pontoons, so that that wouldn't be a problem there. Then the question came up of additional cracking, which was on the walls and the end walls. And so we said, well, wait a minute, there's something that's going on here that's a little unexpected and more than we would like to see. So the panel was then pulled together in June of 2012 to look at those and began to think about the structural dynamics, what was happening with the concrete, the placement, the movements, the shrinkages, the thermal effects that were in that, and the pre-stressing forces. And pretty quickly the panel realized that the dynamics of the end wall with the pre-stressing tendons, which are not symmetrically spaced around the perimeter, they're actually grouped in the top slab and the bottom slab. And so what's beginning to happen is those groups press on the bolt beam at the bottom and the top. It tends to wrap the bolt beam around the precast interior walls, which are much older than the keel slab and the walls, and therefore much stronger. And so they're resisting, and they're not pre-stressed. So we basically said, here's some of the dynamics that's causing this particular crack. And the concern with that crack is if it's driven by the pre-stressing, it may continue to grow over time. So what we did then was we began to pull in some analytical tools, including what I call finite element models, which are mathematical representations of the pontoons in a very fine scale, plus the pre-stressing. And with those models, we can then add the pre-stressing to the time history of the thermal and concrete shrinkage and a poor sequence, and begin to see what's happening with stresses as time progresses. And those models confirm the dynamics of the end wall and what was happening. So the cracks on the end wall fundamentally come from the thermal shrinkage, the concrete shrinkage, some movements from the top deck as it's compressed under the pre-stressing and the pre-stressing itself. So the first statement was made was what we need to do is get some transverse rebar as much as we can possibly get additional into the transverse component of the bolt beam at the top and bottom. Then as we looked at the models, we realized that the cracks were going to grow over time with the pre-stressed driving forces from the end, and therefore it was decided to put transverse pre-stressing, retrofit to cycle 1, incorporate in cycle 2 and cycle 3 beyond, to compress the ends to counter that splitting force. So that's actually what's happening and being done. All of this is being done basically as quickly as possible, interactively with WSDOT and the contractor and the WSDOT Bridge Office and the construction section represented by Jeff, and to do this as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So what's important is now to differentiate two things, and that's the difference between cracking and maintenance and long-term leakage sealing and performance on the lake versus the structural capacity of the pontoons. So it turns out that the prime criteria for design of the pontoons is limitation of potential cracks under load. And so if you do that aggressively to limit those cracks, it turns out that the reinforcing and the pre-stressing that's needed to do that is in excess of what's needed for the structural capacity. So what the panel was asked to do was then to look at, with another independent engineer, Parsons Brinkerhoff, who had a finite element model and also had worked on the Hood Canal Bridge, is to look at what was going to happen in terms of that pre-stressing environment and where we go with it. So what's happening is we now understand the behavior of the pontoons, the concrete, the pre-stressing, how it all fits together, and what's a reasonable solution. But in the context that we've validated, these guys have poured through the design calculations and the loading. You know, the loading, 80 loading cases on the bridge. from wind, wave, earthquake, and the live loads that are imposed on it, plus the loads that the anchors employ to hold it in place. And what we found very quickly was that the structural sufficiency of the pontoon itself was way beyond what we're going to see in the lifetime of the bridge in terms of loading. So that's something to relax about. That's an okay thing. So it leaves the question of how do we close the cracks, how do we seal the cracks, and how do we seal them on a long-term basis. So there's work now going on to seal those Cycle 1 cracks, and Jeff will talk a little bit more about that. But also the fact that we were asked to look at some other areas, the quality of the constructed pontoons. So very briefly, turns out that analysis of the Hood Canal crack lengths and frequencies compared to the Cycle 1 pontoons coming out of Aberdeen, it's about the same. So these concrete structures and placements are performing about the same as the Hood Canal. So while we're okay with that, we also want to minimize cracks. So the minimization gets into the properties of the concrete, the placing, the thermal controls, lots of factors that go into that. The repair strategy, so this includes epoxy injection of cracks that are 0.6 thousandths of an inch or greater. And so that's a process whereby epoxy is injected into the cracks, seals the cracks, bonds to the concrete. It's not necessarily structurally, so it's totally a sealant process. Cracks below 0.006 essentially are sealed with a crystalline waterproofing, which fills those cracks but also promotes the self-healing of the concrete. So concrete itself, if the crack is small, if there's available cement components and there's moisture, will eventually seal. And I know some people are pretty skeptical about that, so I have an article up here you can read that will tell you why that happens, how it happens, and what we think is going on. But essentially we could, fundamentally, not bother to seal cracks under 0.006. WSDOT is using the crystalline waterproofing to make sure that happens. The fourth area we looked at were maintenance considerations, were there additional maintenance considerations required here, different than WSDOT already employs for its floating bridges? And the answer was no. We expect that the contractor sealing the cracks and the measures we're putting in place will result in pontoons that are similar to all other WSDOT floating bridges, and the maintenance requirements for those bridges will also apply to this. And in fact, there was no maintenance budget associated with this, and we think that's appropriate. So let's do that. So I've covered structural sufficiency, which is where are we? I wasn't looking at I'm used to having the screen in front of you. So let me stop at that point. Let me turn it over to Jeff in terms of the construction activities, and later on I'll have plenty of time for questions.
Thanks, John. I'm going to talk a little about what we're doing right now with active construction. We'll start with the Cycle 1 repairs. Those, for those of you not familiar, those are the pontoons that are currently on Lake Washington. So right now we've hired Ben Seeker through the joint venture Kiewit General Manson to do an analysis of Cycle 1, the full crack mapping underneath the pontoons in the lake through diving, and to make recommendations on how to affect any cracking that is found. So through the recommendations, we're looking to repair all cracks greater than 6/1000th of an inch through epoxy sealing, and looking to retrofit in transverse post-tensioning, that's to address the design flaw we've got on the lake. Both of those are going to require a copper cell to be put in underneath the pontoons, so we can do this work in the dry. If we do it in the dry, obviously the quality will be a lot higher for the finished work as well as safer for the workers. And we're going to delay joining the pontoons until this work is completed and we can be sure we've got a good product. So the repairs we're looking to address will address any seepage we've seen in the pontoons. The survey we did, we do only have one spot that does have observed seepage. And just a quick note on the concrete itself, I need to point out that Kiewit General from the pontoon manufacturer did meet all concrete requirements for the projects, and we're satisfied contractually they don't have any issue with the concrete on this project. Moving on to Cycle 2, these are the pontoons actively being constructed in Aberdeen. So we've made some modifications to address the issues. The first is we have modified the post-tensioning duct profile, which reduces the radius, which was associated with the spalling we observed in Cycle 1. We're adding transverse post-tensioning to Cycle 2 within both the cross pontoon and longitudinal pontoons. in the grading dock before we close them out. We have continued efforts in beefing up our efforts in construction monitoring, including thermal control and quality processes. We've already had 9 interior panels with QH General's quality assurance rejected prior to incorporation, so their quality system is working. The overall level of cracking in cycle 2 is lower than in cycle 1 this stage. Again, to remind everybody, we're still in the final stages of completion of cycle 1, but at this point we have observed less cracking. And continued diligence to map the cracks and repair them within the contract requirements as we proceed forward. And right now, the float out for cycle 2 is scheduled for spring, that's what we do right now, 2013. And going and looking into the future, cycle 3 and beyond. The similar situation, we modified the post-tensioning duct alignments. Similar to cycle 2, that's going to be a consistent. We're also having improved transverse post-tensioning, which will be incorporated into the bolt beam for cycles 3 and beyond. So a slight modification to how we're going to be addressing the post-tensioning in the future projects or future cycles. That I'm going to turn it over to Julie Meredith, the 520 Program Manager.
I'm just going to give a little overview on the SR 520 program budget. As you recall, the legislature capped the program at $4.65 billion for expenditures. Late last year, we updated our estimate, and we estimate the entire program from I-5 in Seattle up to 202 in Redmond at $4.13 billion, which is a reduction in general of the anticipated cost of the Seattle side of the project. So far, the legislature has allocated $2.72 billion, and of course, there's the gap of about $1.4 billion necessary to complete the project. We've had a great bidding climate on the 520 program that has allowed us to leverage the funds that have been allocated to completion of the Pontoon construction project, the floating bridge and landings project, and the work on the East Side Transit and HOV project. As part of our management of the construction, we also allocate contingency funding, which is an agency and a national standard for dealing with construction projects. We've allocated $250 million towards that part of our program. At this point, we have $200 million left to address issues as we've experienced. We track those issues and we evaluate them as the program moves on. My field staff gives me weekly reports on what they experience and see, and while that's great information for management, the field staff does not always have a holistic understanding of either the program or the program-wide issues. So, next slide. We're in discussions with our contractor as we speak on schedule recovery and change orders. The contractor has been asked to present options for us to evaluate to advance the schedule for the floating bridge so that we could have it as open as soon as possible to address the vulnerable existing 520 structures. The opening date will be announced as we confirm it with our contractor. We're getting close to completing the first change order negotiations. We expect to complete that in next month. That will address the construction that we did between June and July of last year when we experienced the spalling that John Reilly spoke about. So that work, that change order will come out next month. This will be a continuing negotiation process. The next phase will be discussing with our contractor will be the modifications that we need to do for cycles 1 and 2 and the design modifications for cycles 3 through 6. That design work has just been completed and handed over to the contractor. They will need to incorporate that into their design methodologies going forward. So the continuing negotiations will go on, and I expect it to continue throughout this year and potentially into next year. It will be a long and protracted discussion.
So as I mentioned earlier, an agency like ours that has a lot of responsibility for delivery of capital improvement projects only gets better if you learn from mistakes that were made. And one of the issues that I wanted to make sure that we looked at as we were asking our expert panel and others to help us understand what the problems were on the design and the capital delivery side, where did we go wrong as an agency? And this is something that I had commissioned an internal review, which I believe you have in your packets the results of. And it's a very thorough analysis of all of the factors that may have led to problems in the delivery of this project to date. One of the things that we knew from the beginning was that we had committed to a very aggressive capital delivery schedule. And when we got to the place where the contractor accepted our design of the pontoons inside of a design build contract, we ended up with a contract that we as an agency had not delivered before. And so one of the things that you'll see in the review that we come to understand now is that the roles, responsibilities, and alignment within our capital delivery team were not as clear as they should have been within the team members. And that's something that we have taken steps already to correct and are working to make sure that the contract as written is adhered to by the contractor and the capital or the construction administration staff in the field. So there's that. The other issue that we've come to understand, once the expert panel put together the analysis and the model, as John Reilly referenced, that truly showed where the stresses and the post-tensioning forces reacted with the pontoons as designed, the flaw in the design was evident. And as we came to find out is that we as a WSDOT design team did not run a model that could have and should have shown where those stresses and flaws were in the design as it was put together. There's other issues throughout that report that we're happy to speak to or respond to, but I would say that one of the most important things for us is to make sure that as an agency we come out of this construction program stronger, understand the kinds of contracts that we have put together, make sure that we are responsible to the citizens of the state, and most importantly, make sure that we have a quality product that will serve the state for the many years that we intend for our capital delivery programs to be in service. I think at this point we'll stop and take questions. Any of the panel members, myself or the other directors?
I've got a question for you, Secretary Hammond. Your remarks so far haven't really matched up with some of the quotes in this press release, which seem to imply, in my reading, say, we messed up big time. I'd like you to run over, please, what standards were not followed, what protocols were not followed, what failures you recognize that you agree with as far as the internal review findings.
Okay, so let me just go back to the place where we start with design. We've come to learn, well, first of all, let me go to where do we do with the report that we have. So we have from John Reilly and Associates, the internal report that he produced and gave to me this morning. I had seen a draft, so I knew that as we got ready for this morning, I knew what was in it. The findings there show that agency protocols and practices were not followed adequately. It's not to say that they weren't followed at all. Of course, we do many things right. But in this case, where there's an error by an employee, we're all humans, things happen. Where an employee or a group of employees doesn't adhere to protocols and practices, that the agency has, or our standards of good practice for a professional engineering certification, then we're going to have a problem with that. And we have mistakes in this contract from that standpoint. So as a result of this report today, I've asked my Chief of Staff, Steve Reinman, to start the proceedings for accountability for the employees in the agencies who failed to follow appropriate protocols and processes. We have due process with state personnel laws, and we're going to make sure we cover that very carefully and give our employees a fair chance to respond to any findings that are in this report. So we don't have those accountabilities or disciplines to report to you today, but they are coming. So where I think there were maybe 3 categories of flaws, I think in the alignment around understanding the kind of contract we had and the roles and responsibilities and how the contractor would be managed from a delivery of the product was confusing. And we had employees in the agency who were confused and not necessarily resolving those confusions that they had. So you'll find that in that report. I mentioned already that in the design of the pontoons, there was a failure to run a model that should have checked the work and the design that was done. And I believe that under the standards of good practice of a structural engineer, as does our panel, work was missed, and that work should have been done. Thirdly, in the field in Aberdeen, we had a contract again that hadn't been administered before, and there were confusions, or at least the allowance of the contractor to make changes, or changes were directed in the field that were not documented by a change order. And what that does then is just add confusion as we go to settle a change order, now that we have a flaw in the design that we have to settle. And there's a lot of conversation back and forth between what was the contractor's responsibility and what is the state's. And that's why I wanted to dig into what the real story was here.
Could heads roll? Could people lose their jobs over this?
I think it's possible, but we're going to do the due process, and we're going to make sure that everybody has their day to respond to any accusations that are made.
You have said that you can't get too much into the financial ramifications, but I'll bet you right now, everybody who's seeing this, and we're carrying it live, is wondering two things. How much more is it going to cost me as a taxpayer? Will your $200 million contingency fund cover these costs? Or are people going to have to fork out more taxpayer money to pay for these? And what will be the delays in terms of your schedule here? It sounds like if you've got to retrofit some pontoons, and I don't even know how many are in cycle 1 and cycle 2, but it sounds like if you got to retrofit those and then change the designs or impose these changes on cycle 2, we're talking weeks, maybe months of delays.
Well, I think I'll ask either Jeff or Julie to speak to the timelines associated with changes. I think there were 6 pontoons in cycle 1. I'm looking for validation of that. 6 pontoons in cycle 1. In this contract, 33 of the ultimate 77 pontoons are built under this contract. The other 44 are being built in Tacoma. They're considered flankers. There's those pontoons that kind of buoy out on the side of the bridge that are going well, and we're already into cycle 3. So, so do one of you want to speak to the time for repairs?
Maybe you can talk about whether $200 million in contingency, the risk fund, will cover this, or whether or not it could be more.
Well, of course, we're still working on whether or not and how much of the schedule we can recover, which can add to the cost. So that's one of the things. As we now have the repairs and the design modifications in hand, how now do we go forward to deliver this contract in a way that compresses the schedule as much as possible so that delays to the opening of the bridge don't drag on? I have every reason to believe, based on what we know today, that the contingency fund we have is adequate. As we work forward to help discover whether there are opportunities to compress the schedule, we may spend some money in order to save more money later. In other words, if you spend some money to have the contractor change their methods, that may be a way then to reduce the impact of a delay cost out the other end of the project. The one thing to note is, as we talked about the fact that we are beginning the negotiations for the first change order on this topic, the whole issue of the delay and the compression of the schedule in each cycle, this will go on for a while. And so it's not one change order that resolves all of this, but as we look to incorporate any compression of schedule, that will come over a series of time.
I think the second half of that question was originally in December, Julie, you said that we were looking at 2015, the summer of 2015 for completion, now a 6-month delay. Is that still the target?
I have every reason to believe, again, until we get into the repairs and understand the timing of the retrofits on the lake, that we can still deliver the contract within 2015.
There's currently a whistleblower complaint filed against WSDOT regarding specifically the engineering issue, and that there has been an ongoing problem within WSDOT in terms of construction engineers signing off on structural engineers' work, and that the pontoon designs has become sort of the perfect storm of that.
Would you like to speak to that? I'll just start by saying I'm not aware of a whistleblower report. That's a very specific complaint. I'm not aware of that. And Jeff, do you want to talk about this construction engineer stamping plans?
Yeah.
Because we don't do
Or
that.
signing off on changes to plans. And maybe if
Yeah.
someone could address who is the engineer of record for these pontoons, the pontoon
WSDOT.
design?
Go ahead. Oh.
I'll speak briefly to the challenge we get with the whistleblower. If we don't have specifics, it's impossible for me to respond, Tracy, to what you're talking about. There are a lot of changes and issues throughout this project, so if there's a specific time and date, we can actually answer very effectively. But to a general one, there's nothing we can say. We do have a construction engineering arm within WSDOT. It works closely with the engineer of record across the board, whether that's geotechnical, geometrics, traffic, structures. We go to the engineer of record on engineering changes. As stated, there's a lot of material determining substantive compliance with the plans. That's a responsibility of our bridge construction engineer. And then the question we have an issue in the field is a structural concern or a long-term maintenance concern. And that's where he has to make a judgment call going forward. If there's specifics and the whistleblower, or whatever you're referring to, it comes out with specifics, we can answer to it, but to a generic, there's nothing really we can say beyond. That's just a standard protocol WSDOT has.
Are the
Yes,
faults
John?
and failures all within the Department of Transportation? I heard a line at some point in there that Keywood General, they fulfill their contract, their concrete work is fine. Is the blame here being pointed to the agency itself in failures to follow standards and protocols within WSDOT?
Again, this is an ongoing contract negotiation, so there's some things I'm not going to fully be able to share with you, just as we worked with the contractors on the impacts related to these issues. But WSDOT is the ultimate engineer of record for these pontoons. Any issue with design is squarely on our shoulders.
John, can I ask you a question about that? As you're the head of the expert, if you could step up to the podium. As it's been described to me, WSDOT structural engineers put together the M11 drawings, and then it was up to the contractor, Keywood General, to pull those drawings together and do all of the final drawings and the shop drawings and the ready for construction plans. How does that fit into what you're saying and what Secretary Hammond is saying, that it's a design flaw? Whose fault is that design flaw? Is that Keywood's or is that WSDOT's?
It was clarified in addenda about the engineer of record that WSDOT was the engineer of record for the pontoon components. Keywood General and subsequently the floating bridge and landings contractor adds elements to the pontoons. To the extent that they add elements, they're responsible for those elements. KG is also responsible for the integration of all that in the release for construction drawings. And there was a requirement in the specs for them to stamp and seal those drawings. So part of the confusion that Secretary Hammond talked about was that the engineer of record for the pontoons is WSDOT, and the stamps and seals that are on those individual plans. And yet, we're asking the contractor to stamp and seal a set of drawings that includes that. You have a mixed set of responsibilities, potentially confusion about that. And that's what we were trying to say in the report.
I'd like Jeff
Yeah.
to speak to that as well.
So again, when we talk about, Tracy mentioned the release for construction drawings. The design builder does have the responsibility to take our drawings and incorporate them in with any changes they've made related to contractor access, catwalk placement. So as they consolidate those plans, those become the release for construction drawings. But the responsibility for the engineering, initial design, and the pontoons themselves rests with WSDOT. We are the engineer of record for these pontoons.
What about cycle 2? We're seeing, I just got a hold of some crack map drawings for cycle 2, and I know you've said that the cracking overall is less, but it shows significant, extensive cracking on the keel slabs, it shows extensive on the bottoms, extensive cracking on the top slab for all of the ones that we've seen crack maps for so far. John or Neil, you're the experts in concrete and so forth. Why are we seeing those problems? And my sources are telling me that even if they're not structural, they're still significant.
I'd first like Jeff to
Okay.
talk about what really is out there,
Right.
not just what is hearsay.
So I'll defer to John and Neil, but the cracks we've seen out there, we have very limited structural cracking, none beyond the allowable 30 feet of structural cracks in a section of a pontoon. So the amount of structural cracking is significantly less. The shrinkage cracking is what you're referring to, and even the shrinkage cracking is substantially less than we had in cycle 1. And with that, I'm going to turn to John to discuss that. But what we're talking about is that the cracks that are less than 6/1000th of an inch.
And how many pontoons in cycle 2? Someone add that number,
6.
please.
6.
6 again?
6.
6. So 6 in 1 and 6 in 2.
Again, I want to differentiate one thing. When we talk about structural crack, the way structural is determined in the contract is between 0, 0, 6 and higher. We are not concerned about structural capability. Focus that question. Now, unfortunately, I haven't seen crack maps for cycle 2, and I haven't been to the site for cycle 2. Larry, I think, has looked at those. Is there a statement you could make about what you've seen so far? because not all of the mapping's been done on cycle 2. There's still forms that are in place that preclude mapping. Larry Kyle is the engineering manager for the SR 520 program. So he's responsible for the coordination and integration of all engineering on the project.
Thanks, John. I was at Aberdeen last Thursday with a group of individuals, including Steve Tatro, who's the concrete expert for the panel. And we visited the site, we looked at the pontoons, and we did look at locations where there were cracks, where the repairs had been done. And the cracking level I saw was indeed less than in cycle 1. And if I can paraphrase Steve Tatro's statements in the meetings after the site visit, he said he was not concerned about that level of cracking observed on the cycle 2 pontoons. Cracking is to be expected, and the repair procedures that are being employed for repairing both the structural cracks that Jeff mentioned, but also the non-structural cracks, is appropriate for this type of construction and is expected to hold for 75 years.
Can somebody explain, and forgive me because I don't have an engineering background, but we got to have a very simple explanation of what the fix is, and by that I mean to the longitudinal lengthwise pre-tensioning or pre-stressing. What's another way of saying this? Are we doing pressure testing on these structures? Is that it? And maybe you can explain in very simple terms how pressure was applied on the lengthwise on these pontoons, and now you're going to do it widthwise as well. I'd like something that most of our viewers can at least understand as to what you're going to do to these pontoons to try to prevent additional cracking in addition to sealing the cracks that are already there.
Okay, so concrete cracks, we said that several times. The way to prevent cracking is to put pressure on it. You mentioned pressure. The pontoons were originally designed with longitudinal post-tensioning tendons that put pressure in the long direction of the pontoons, putting compression in the concrete so it won't crack or will minimize cracks. What the panel found were cracks in the end walls and on the keel slab that went in the other direction. And so the solution, as mentioned, is to use, again, post-tensioning to put pressure transversely in the other direction in the ends of the pontoons. So that puts pressure on the concrete. It then closes the cracks in some cases, but in general puts compression in the concrete to prevent the cracks from opening or to control the crack.
And how do you do this tensioning? Do you draw a cable through it and pull the ends together, or how do you get that pressure? Explain very simply how it's done.
That's exactly how it's done.
You explain, please.
It's steel. You use steel cable. You run it from side to side, and you're exactly right. You pull on the steel cable and push on the concrete, and there are anchorages to hold the stress in the steel to put continuous pressure on the concrete through the life of the structure.
So you've been saying that the cycle 2 pontoons have less cracking than cycle 1, and I think less than Hood Canal Bridge. Can you quantify that in terms of either numbers of cracks or length, aggregate length of the cracks? When we say less than, same as, what does that mean?
It's in the report that you have. There's the experience of Hood Canal compared to Aberdeen, and also the supplementals of concrete technology. Sorry, excuse me. In the report material you've got, there are appendices which have the measurements of the cracks at the Hood Canal and at the Aberdeen site, and also a comparison of the supplementals at Aberdeen and the ones that are being made in concrete technology in Tacoma. So you can see the comparison, and that comparison is then summarized in tables in the report.
Can someone comment, Secretary Hammond mentioned that the critical modeling was not done. Why didn't that happen? That seems like a fairly standard procedure for engineering, that you run models before you build things.
Do you want to speak to the acceptability or the process that is normally followed?
We, the panel, don't know why they didn't do it. It's such an obvious thing that should have been done.
Should that have been done by the structural engineers at WSDOT?
Yes.
Are those the folks who will bear the responsibility regarding your internal review?
Yeah, we're going to look at all of the processes and protocols within the design and the capital project delivery, the construction administration, to see not only where there were design issues, but as we have areas where the quality acceptance and quality control, quality verification had flaws, as well as changes that were made in the field that were not fully documented by change orders. So there's a series of issues. I would say the most expensive, if you will, flaw is the design flaw on this bridge.
And Kiewit has their own, they have their own concrete and engineering advisors and their own decades of experience building these bridges. Why didn't they wind up creating safety net for WSDOT by noticing this transverse risk, the cracking and the end wall flaws? Wouldn't it have been plausible that Kiewit should have noticed it in their own diligence?
That'd be nice if they did. In fact, when we first got involved in June and looked at this transverse question of the cracking in the longitudinal direction, the back of the envelope gave us the first indication, the first rough finite element gave us one. Kiewit actually did the same thing with their firm, so they actually confirmed what we also found in terms of the driving forces.
When they saw the problem.
That was
when they saw
that was post-construction.
Right.
Money morning quarterbacking.
Right. So when the contract was made clear that WSDOT was the engineer of record, it was not the responsibility of Kiewit to check our work.
Right, but did they raise any yellow or red flags to you based on their own diligence?
No.
I have a question. In a design build contract, and again, you talked about that, Secretary Hammond, that this is sort of a new endeavor for WSDOT. But my understanding was that with option A that they went with, that basically it was supposed to, the idea is that it's supposed to transfer liability to the design builder because they are ultimately responsible for the design build part of the project. How did that not happen?
Well, Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about the construct of the contract? Design build is one thing, and when we have a design element within the design build, which by the way, it's, when you said it's a new construct, we don't intend to ever do this again. That's my recommendation, that we not have a design bid build element within a design build contract. We ended up with that as a way that we got a very good bid from the contractor. We were all concerned about the time elements and delivery of this bridge. We were working as hard as we could to have concurrent processes that would allow us to open the bridge by the late 2014 so that we did not experience a catastrophic failure if there was an earthquake or a wind and wave action. And so we were working very diligently on that time frame. It did not mean that anybody inside our agency should have taken shortcuts on what they were doing and as they were responsible for this contract.
Is that what happened? Shortcuts were taken?
I don't know. We're still trying to figure out why the model wasn't run that would have verified the design that was put forth in this contract. But Jeff, did you want to talk at all about, is there something I didn't mention?
Just the option A and option B. During the procurement phase of this, the design build, the industry was given two options. They could produce their own design build and own the pontoons and do their own design, or they could utilize WSDOT's design. This was done at request of industry to have this option because they felt there was a lot of risk for them to design the pontoons and then have a separate design builder or someone in the future to build the structure on top of it, along with a very complex wind wave analysis that WSDOT had already completed, and that was our work product. So the option was put in for the design builders, if they wanted to ask WSDOT to utilize WSDOT's pontoons. Through the series of questions and answers through the bid process, WSDOT did produce an addendum and stating emphatically that's where we're at right now. And they did opt to utilize our design.
If the contractors were telling WSDOT that they wanted this as an option because they didn't want to bear the liability, shouldn't that have raised some red flags among the folks that were considering and putting this contract together?
Right. The concern
Because
of the industry...
it leaves WSDOT and thus the taxpayers exposed.
Yeah, that's fair. But the industry concern was based on could they meet the time requirements of our contract and to get it done within the time we required, given the complex amount of work WSDOT had already accomplished and owned with the wind wave analysis. So when they looked at the combination between the two, they didn't see a way they could make it work.
Well, and I want to be clear that when WSDOT offered the option for a pontoon design, we never imagined that we would have a problem with our design. We worked on this project and worked very carefully on development of major projects, and risks are taken. Actually, folks want us to take risks in order to achieve the impossible. When we accept that risk, we don't expect that we're going to have a flaw in something that we are normally very good at. as Mr. Reilly said, we have pontoons out there that are what engineers call conservatively designed, very good design, features, but there's a flaw. And so while the overall pontoon health, strength, and structural soundness is very good, there was a mistake made. And that's something that you never would have expected when you take this risk. Remember, we got such a good bid on this contract because the contractor relieved themselves of the risk of the design pontoons. We would not, Monday morning quarterbacking, you'd never go back and assume that you should take a risk unless you had confidence in the processes and procedures that the agency has. And so where there's a failure, we have to learn from that. We have to have accountability around that, and that's what we're proceeding to do next.
So can taxpayers
Last question.
assume that, can taxpayers be assured that after that cycle 2, once we go through the post-tensioning, we're not going to see those problems? I mean, what can you assure taxpayers of at this point in time?
Well, one of the things that was most important to me to make sure we could assure the taxpayers is the product that they will end up with is going to be a good product. Safe, sound, and serving the life expectancy of this corridor project. Second, we've learned something about our internal communication, alignment, roles and responsibilities, and those corrective actions are already in place as far as changing and making sure communication inside the agency is strong, and that we have the best people in place to finish this project. And thirdly, that when we make mistakes and when we have employees who don't follow procedures and processes, we're going to stand up to it, and we have. We've been very transparent about our problems here. We're also going to be accountable to the taxpayers and learn from that, make sure that we don't find ourselves in this kind of a situation again. And that's, as we move forward, our pledge to the taxpayers.
Well, thank you very much.